It's a delight to welcome you back, fight fans, for the second part of the Jack Johnson career profile, and we really hope you did enjoy part 1. Part 2 is going to be even better, and we really hope you enjoy this second part because there's so many stories with Jack Johnson's life inside and outside of the ring that we wanted to bring to you. You'll understand why we've done this in 2 parts as we go through the course of this episode, because there's so many things that you can't just cram it into one podcast. As we said in the first part, you'll be here for 3-4 hours trying to do one Jack Johnson podcast, which I think is just too difficult to listen to. But Johnston, there's some great stories for part 2. I'm really looking forward to breaking down becoming the world champion, his life outside of the ring, and obviously the later years of Jack Johnson.
I can't wait, mate. Yeah, there's so many stories outside the ring that we're all aware of. We've got some cracking little stories in here. Some a bit tragic and some are quite funny. So it's a bit of a mixed match, really. I mean, the funny thing is while we're doing this, it sort of fell into that darker side of boxing side of things at times with some of the stuff that happens. But obviously, this is a career profile. We've tried to keep it all boxing, but this is Jack Johnson. You can't just keep it all boxing, unfortunately, because he's just a whole package, isn't he? But can't wait to get this second part going. I think it might just edge the first because there's so much more that happens at this time of his life.
Now, we ended the first part of Jack Johnson's story with Tommy Burns travelling to England to fight the British heavyweight champion James Gunner Muir. Now, he had promised that once he had retained his title, he would return to America and fight the world #1 top contender, Jack Johnson. Now, instead, Burns decided to stay in England and see out the new year before an intended move back to America at the beginning of 1908. But the lure of easier fights and for decent money made him change his mind, and instead he stayed in England and knocked out Jack Palmer in February before heading to Dublin the following month to stop Jem Roche in just 1 round. Johnson, of course, he wasn't surprised by this. He told a reporter Burns promised before he left for England to fight Gunner Muir that he would return immediately after the battle and meet me. Now, I understand he is going to stay in England for several months and pick up a little easy money by beating heavyweights over there. Burns could make as much in a fight with me in the United States as he could by beating half a dozen Englishmen. He knows that, but as he is not confident that he can defeat me, Burns wants to stay and pick up the soft money floating around. Now, when Burns was questioned about this, his response was, "Oh, what do I care? I am having a mighty good time and getting a lot of experience, and what is considerably more to the point, I am getting the coin. They call me crazy for not rushing over to meet Johnson, but just put this down in your notebook. They will never have to hold any benefit for me."
So while Johnson was in limbo, he fought only one bout. It was a 3-round exhibition in New York City with one of our favourite fighters, Joe Jeanette, for the 10th time. Now, outside the ring, he actually lost his dad, Henry Johnson, at some point in 1907. Not quite sure exactly when that was. And he toured doing the vaudevilles in 1908. His stage act was to shadow box, spar, dance, and ended each performance by whacking a specially rigged punching bag into the audience. It was a trick that was actually pinched from Bob Fitzsimmons. Now, he billed himself as Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world, the man who made Jim Jeffries take to the Alphala. While earning extra money on his act, or his stage act, Johnson also confirmed the rumours in the newspapers that he was going to marry Lola Toy, the girl he met in Australia. He said, "Yes, it's true that I am to marry Miss Toy, and I expect to marry her in November. She will come from Sydney, Australia, and I expect that our wedding will take place in this country. I met her in Australia, and after our courtship, she consented to accept me. I now have something to fight for aside from the honours. I want to make a name for myself that my future wife will not be ashamed of." Now, in an interesting turn of events, Lola Toy, she said it was a load of old nonsense, and she actually sued the Australian newspaper, the Referee, for printing false allegations or false news. She was awarded £500 in compensation, and Johnson never passed any more comments on Lola Toy.
Now, weeks after the Toy versus the Referee case, Johnson had decided to travel to London, accompanied by Sam Fitzpatrick and Hattie McClay, to shame Tommy Burns out of King Edward's Islands. Now, on their arrival, Johnson and Fitzpatrick met with either Frederick Peggy Bettington, manager of the National Sporting Club in London, who offered $12,500 for the championship fight to be held at Covent Garden. When Tommy Burns received the offer, he said, "If Johnson really wants to fight me, he ought to be glad to accept any terms I offer. My terms are $30,000 win, lose or draw." It was a ludicrous offer, and newspapers, fans and Johnson knew that Burns was trying to price himself out of a fight, and Johnson responded with, "The whole truth of the matter is that Burns does not want to fight me. It is he and not me who has a yellow streak." Now, many newspapers were beginning to slate the champion, but Burns, he wasn't bothered by the bad publicity. His answer was a simple one. Now, let me ask you a sensible question, for I judge that most of you are business people. If you were working for £3 a week, and you know that you could get £6 a week for a similar job, would you take the job at £6? The same thing applies to the offer for Johnson and myself. Why should I accept this amount when I can get twice that amount elsewhere? While in Britain, even King Edward VII chimed in, who himself was an avid sportsman, calling Burns a mere bluffer whose vulgar financial demands should never be met in Britain.
So with the press and even the king digging at Burns now, he moved to Paris, France, to escape their bad press, and Johnson, well, he followed behind. The champ was going to rub salt in the wounds by fighting Sam McVeigh instead of Jack Johnson. But that fight fell through. Instead, on June 13, Burns knocked out Bill Squires in eight rounds. Once again, Johnson sat at ringside and he told a reporter, "It's downright weary work chasing a man around the world. It makes one real tired, it does indeed." All this chasing of Tommy Burns had not only left Johnson tired, but he was inactive as well. And he had been put out of the ring now for 7 months, and he was finally ready to return for a fight with a guy called Ben Taylor in Plymouth. Now, Johnson didn't take his bigger opponent very seriously, and he spent much of the days leading up to the fight getting himself pissed. He was actually hungover for the fight, which he won by an 8-round knockout. He was adamant that he could take Taylor out earlier, but said, "I let Taylor stay just to give the spectators a run for their money. Not once during the fight did Taylor land more than a light jab on me." Now, Burns then decided to move on again, but this time to the other side of the world. He went to Australia, and once again Johnson would follow, but not straight away. Now, his fortunes would change thanks to a fresh-faced 30-year-old Australian promoter called Huge Deal McIntosh. Now, he was the catalyst in promoting Burns' next 2 fights in Australia. A third bout against Bill Squires and first against Bill Lang. His first was a 13-round knockout of Squires in front of 19,000 people at the outdoor arena in Sydney. Before Burns faced Lang, McIntosh made steps to arranging a Burns-Jack Johnson fight by talking several very wealthy sports investors into helping him come up with $30,000, which is $800,000 in today's currency, and that was what Burns had demanded. Then he exchanged telegrams with Scott Fitzpatrick. Johnson was offered $5,000, which is $145 in today's currency, to come back to Sydney for the chance to fight for the world title. Now, although Johnson at first was gobsmacked by the low ball offer, he was forced to accept a poor one, 1/6 of what the champion would be getting, because of the opportunity was basically too good for Jack Johnson to pass up.
Now, as we mentioned in the Sam Langford episode, Fitzpatrick had already agreed for Johnson to fight Langford in London, but with the offer now in place for Johnson to fight for a world title, he agreed with promoter Peggy Bettington that they would return with the world title and fight Langford after he had dealt with Burns. Bettington agreed to delay the fight and even paid for Johnson and Fitzpatrick to travel to Australia with one condition: that Johnson sign a letter with a promise of coming back to London to fight Langford before heading back to America. Now Burns flattened Lang in 6 rounds to retain his title for the last time, and Johnson arrived in Australia full of confidence. The big fight was set for 22 round at Rushcutters Bay in Sydney on Boxing Day of 1908. Many American boxers were disappointed with Burns for taking the fight because he was giving a black fighter the chance for the first time in history of the sport to win the World Heavyweight title. John L. Sullivan, he was quoted as saying, "Shame on the money-mad champion, shame on the man who upsets good American precedents because there are dollars, dollars, dollars in it." Now, although Johnson was a huge hit in Australia a year before, the press turned against him and began to side with Burns weeks before the fight. His gloating did rub many the wrong way, but there is no denying the colour of his skin was the real factor for the change of heart. Many of the articles, not just in the Australian press but across the world, were so racially offensive that we just can't even share any of them with you because we do think it's so racist that we don't even want to bring these newspapers and these articles any sort of credit or any name dropping because of how poor they were by doing that. Now, Johnson, he did all he could to change the public's perception of him, but nothing worked. Let's face it, nothing would have ever worked.
Absolutely not. And if you want to know, what they said, go and find out yourself because some of them are just, oh dear, it's just dreadful. The public may have turned its back on Johnson, but he had an entourage that a certain Sugar Ray Robinson would have been pretty proud of. A sports writer, he wrote about this entourage. He said he has the biggest staff of helpers the writer has ever seen by waiting on any fighter. The man who rubs him down doesn't run with him. The runner doesn't put the gloves on with him. His sparring partner does nothing but spar. It resembles the state of things that prevails in a big British household where each servitor knows his and her duties and is prepared to drop dead or give notice if an innovation is suggested. James J. Jeffries was originally offering to referee the fight at $5,000 plus travel expenses, but Johnson rightly rejected it. I mean, that's the same money he was going to be getting. Now, with only days left to go, a referee was still undecided. So a meeting between the fighters, Fitzpatrick and McIntosh, was arranged. Now, all possible referees were once again rejected by Johnson. He just was no mug. He knew he needed a decent ref if this goes a distance. So he came up with the idea for McIntosh to ref the fight himself. Now, his thinking was smart. If he wanted to be a big-time promoter, then he would have to be fair. Otherwise, he could forfeit the chance of bigger fights in the future. So McIntosh, who had never refereed a boxing match before in his life, agreed to oversee the fight, the mixed contest for the heavyweight world championship title. And there were several claims that the fight would be fixed. But Johnson squashed those rumours, saying, "Just remember this. They are fixing it all up to hand me the lemon. But I won't fall for the game. I'm going to double-cross all the scammers in the world and get the world title."
Now, the fight was set to start at 11 a.m, with 20,000 people crammed in to Sydney Stadium at Rushcutters Bay, and another 30,000 were estimated to be outside the stadium, perched in trees, on roofs, up power poles, and basically wherever they could gain a vantage point to see the fight. Now, a few minutes before Johnson was due to make his ring walk, McIntosh remembered he made one more stab at getting paid what he thought he deserved. He sent word from his dressing room that he would not fight unless he got more money, and he wanted to see the cash before he laced on his gloves. The promoter stormed into Johnson's dressing room. "So you want your money first, do you, cobber? Where's my checkbook?" He reached into his jacket as if it was hidden there, but pulled out a revolver instead. "If you're not in the ring right on time," he said, "I'll skin you alive." Johnson retreated and began to walk to the ring. Once both fighters were in the ring, Johnson noticed Burns wearing elbow pads. He refused to fight unless they were removed. In the end, an official ruled them illegal, and they were removed. And the fight itself was actually delayed by 7 minutes.
All the mind games from Jack there. So seconds after the first bell, Burns, hit the canvas. Johnson landed a huge right uppercut that flattened the champ. He did manage to recover and fire on. Johnson continued with his taunts while in the clinches and in between rounds. He mocked Burns from the start. Poor little Tommy, who told you were a fighter? And on the rare occasion when Burns managed to actually land a punch, Johnson laughed and said, poor Tommy, who thought you could hit? Your mother? Burns would hit the canvas once again from an uppercut. It was by all accounts a one-sided beating. Johnson could have ended it at any point, especially in the sixth. He landed a vicious left hook and Burns sagged. Johnson lifted his opponent upright and helped him back to his corner after the bell sounded. Burns hit the deck again in the seventh, but was resilient and fought on. As the bell rang for the 14th round, Johnson rushed from his corner and landed a right hand that sent him down. He got up, Johnson knocked him down again. Previously, it had been arranged that if the police interfered, a decision would be rendered on points, and following that last knockdown, the police were signalled for the fight to be halted. Now, one bulletin wrote that McIntosh shouted in a voice fit to wake the dead, "Stop, Johnson." McIntosh declared Jack Johnson the winner. One article explained the moment powerfully. It said Johnson waved his hands to the crowd that did not cheer him. A few straggling voices were raised, but they were mere flecks of sound in an ocean of silence.
That moment where he becomes the first African American, the first black fighter to win the World Heavyweight title. Now, within 12 minutes, the stadium was empty, and the video footage that did capture the ending was cut the moment before Burns hit the deck. The Milwaukee Evening Wisconsin said this was to save the white man from witnessing the sight of a black man pounding a white one into near insensibility. The Sydney Sportsman wrote of one of the most appalling pieces, and again, we can only apologise for what we're about to read, but I think it reflects perfectly the idiotic minds of most of the world during that time, and this is what was wrote in the Sydney Sportsman. Had Johnson's nods, becks, smiles, etc. occurred in America, a prominent citizen would inevitably have risen impressively somewhere about the close of the fourth round and, amid encouraging cheers, have drawn a gun upon Johnson and shot that immense mass of black humanity dead. Since Johnson's insolence had all been captured on film, any jury of white men allowed to view it would have exonerated his assassin. The black press was obviously overjoyed. The Richmond Planet wrote, "No event in 40 years has given more satisfaction to the coloured people of this country than has the signal victory of Jack Johnson." And another press wrote, "Armed only with strength and grit and quick wits, Johnson had punched his way up from poverty to wealth and success. Nothing could have been more American."
Absolutely, and a shocking article there, actually saying you're going to shoot Johnson in the ring for bashing someone up. It's just insanity. So Johnson spoke with the press straight after the fight while he was actually getting his rub down, and there was not a mark on his face. In his 1927 autobiography, he wrote, "I had attained my life's ambition." He then went on to write, "Naturally, I felt a high sense of exhilaration, but I kept this feeling to myself. To me, this was not a racial triumph, but there were those who were to take this view of the situation, and almost immediately a great hue and cry went up because a coloured man was holding the championship." Now, Burns wanted an immediate rematch because he felt like he was robbed. Even the racist sports writers never challenged that decision. Jack London, the famous novelist, was in Sydney covering the fight for the New York Herald, and he wrote, "The fight, there was no fight. An American massacre could compare with the hopeless slaughter that took place today. The fight, if fight is what it could be called, was like that between a pygmy and a colossus. Then came the racism once more. But one thing now remains. Jim Jeffries must emerge from the alfalfa farm and remove the golden smile from Jack Johnson's face. Jeff, it's up to you. The white man must be rescued. Ridiculous. Jim Jeffries wanted no part of Johnson. He said, there will be no fight between Jack Johnson and myself. I don't want the money. I'm out of the game and the public might as well understand it. Johnson wanted to accept a rematch, but first Burns had to approach him and he had to beg for it, like Johnson had done where he chased him around the country. He wanted him to squirm like a little girl, and Johnson also couldn't help himself. He bravely took an indirect swipe at the white Australians who continued to batter him racially, and he went out of the way to praise the Aboriginal people whom he knew they also despised. And he actually went to the Sydney Museum and saw the boomerangs and the stone axes, and in his own words he says, your Central Australian natives must have been men of genius to have turned out such artistic and ideal weapons.
On February the 17th, 1909, 8 weeks after beating Tommy Burns and only hours before setting sail for home for Brisbane, the new heavyweight champion of the world headed to Toowong Cemetery to visit the tomb of Peter Jackson, the black Australian heavyweight who had never been given his chance to win the title against John L. Sullivan. Johnson paid his respects and had a moment with one of the best to never win a world title. When Johnson arrived in Canada from Australia, he was scheduled to fight a 6-round exhibition at the Vancouver Athletic Club against Denver Ed Martin. After Martin pulled out, his replacement was Victor Everly McLagan, and Johnson dealt with the British-born fighter in 1 round with a body shot. Now, the fight hardly received any newspaper cover. In fact, a lot of the press talk revolved around Johnson, the man, not Johnson, the boxer. His white girlfriend, Hattie McClay, was introduced to a couple of reporters as his wife, something he did often, but now it was big news. Interracial marriage was officially outlawed in 30 out of the 46 states and discouraged by custom and the threat of violence in many of the rest. The Chicago Tribune was among the first to print the story, and it read, "Beware, Mr. Jack Johnson. Texas authorities will prosecute the champion if he takes white wife to that state." Now, Galveston, his hometown, were due to honour Johnson on his return, but they cancelled because he refused to not bring Hattie. Johnson was now unable to return home to see his widowed mum, so Johnson sent Hattie McClay home to Milwaukee until the dust had settled and he went off to Chicago, backing out of his promise to fight Sam Langford in London.
Well, there you go. That's the answer to the question from Sam when we done his career profile. Now, Johnson and Fitzpatrick ended their ties not long after the Burns win. Fitzpatrick said the championship had gone to Johnson's head. He was a different man before the fight. He would feed out of my hand then, but he is a hard man to handle now. Anyhow, he doesn't want a manager now. He's got his missus. He's got Mrs. Johnson as his manager. Trouble was the relationship between Jack Johnson and Hattie McClay, ended the moment he boarded the train in New York to begin a $7,000 2-week engagement at the Hammerstein's Victoria on Broadway. Johnson said that they split because of her drinking, and she went back to her life as a sporting girl in Philadelphia. When Johnson arrived in Grand Central Station in New York, he was greeted by many of his fans, predominantly black, but some curious whites as well. He enjoyed his time at the Big Apple on the stage for his 2-week engagement at the Hammerstein Victoria, but returned to Chicago looking for a good time. Now, his point of call was the Levee District. It was a red light district in Chicago, which was home to 500 saloons, whorehouses, 15 gambling halls, 6 variety theatres, peep shows, opium dens, cocaine parlours, as well as buffet flats, apartments that provided food and drink, piano music and prostitutes. Had everything. He loved the place, and the place to be if you liked your women and for a higher price, which Johnson did. And it was the Everlay Club in particular, but black men were actually barred. Even Jack Johnson, the world heavyweight champion. Now, his new manager was a guy called George Little. Now, he used to he did collect protection money from everyone in this district, this red light district, each week. And he passed it on to a guy called Bathhouse John McCallin and Hinky Dinky Mike Kenner, couple of mobster guys with funny names. Now, the Everly sisters who run the club had to pay Little $1,000 a month. So when Johnson arrived with Little to collect, he had been let into the property. Now, Johnson didn't stay and sort of messing around with the girls. Instead, he asked 5 ladies to accompany him to drive in his big touring car, something he will have now throughout pretty much his whole career. One of those sporting girls was a girl called Belle Schreiber. Now, it wasn't her real name. Johnson took a shine to her, and they become an item. At the expense of her job, she was actually sacked by the sisters for seeing Jack Johnson, who was a black man. Johnson looked after her. He even bought her an apartment, and she would sometimes accompany him, as of course the new Mrs. Johnson. Now, Clara Kerr did come back requesting that she was owed $406 and threatening legal action against Johnson. Johnson was adamant that she wasn't his wife, but paid her off anyway, rather than for it to go to court and get messy and get his dirty laundry aired in public. So, crazy time there for Jack.
Well, back to the boxing, and on April the 19th, 1909, Jim Jeffries officially came out of retirement and said he would be ready in 8 to 10 months to challenge Jack Johnson. He was quoted as saying that he will put him, as in Johnson, to sleep in 3 minutes. Now, a Stanley Ketchel fight had been agreed for October the 16th, 1909 in San Francisco, but a now out-of-shape Johnson needed a few fights first to get him ready. Now, his first heavyweight title defence was a 6-round bout on May the 19th against Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, in O'Brien's hometown, of course, of Philadelphia. Now, Johnson was not at his best, but he was too big for O'Brien. The newspaper decision was a draw, but most felt that Johnson shaded it. He then went on to spend $4,800 of his $5,000 earnings within 2 days, buying himself a new fast car, his newfound love. Johnson said, "My mind is constantly on automobiles." He and Bell travelled around the east side of America and was snapped by the press and police for speeding. Now, at this point, Johnson, he's broke. He's had that $4,800 spent in 2 days out of that $5,000 earning. So he decides to fight another 6-rounder in Pennsylvania against Antonio Rosolano, a stocky Italian-American who fought under the name Tony Ross. Ross was dropped for the count of 9 in the first round, and in the last round he took a dive to escape a Johnson right hand, but he did get back up to make it to the final bell. After the fight, Johnson and Bell headed to a rented cottage at Cedar Point, Indiana, a summer resort which was 25 miles from Chicago, favoured by the residents of Levee. Now, his trainer, Barney Fury, and sparring partner, Yank Kenny, also went to the cottage, as did George Little, but there wasn't much training going on, just plenty of drinking and car racing. The inevitable happened, and Johnson's car was hit from behind, and one of the sporting girls was seriously hurt, and Johnson, although bleeding, came away from the accident, lucky not to be seriously injured himself.
Silly daft geezer. What the hell was he up to? Johnson returned to California and linked up with Hattie McClay again. He then paid for Bell to travel and pitched up a hotel nearby so he could go between the two women in his life as he pleased. He had signed with Sonny Jim Cothroff for 2 fights in Colma. The big one with Stanley Ketchel in October and a warm-up of sorts against Al Kaufman on September the 9th. Now, the 10-round bout was easily won by Johnson, who toyed with Kaufman, held him back so he wouldn't knock him out. And Johnson recalled, "When he went into the clinch, I would playfully tap Kaufman with my right uppercut, pin his hands, shove him away, and then wing my right and left to his jaw." He was having fun with him in there, basically. And when the bell sounded, the referee refused to hold up his hand as the winner. So it will go down as yet You'll see it on Wiki. You'll see it probably on BoxRec as a draw in the record books. But it was in actual fact a very, very clear win for Jack Johnson. Now, a well-known San Francisco sporting authority was asked after the fight how Jim Jeffries would do against Johnson. His reply was accurate. Jeffries will do well to stay in retirement. Johnson would probably leave the ring with his championship laurels. Johnson, in his battle with Kaufman, proved he is a master of the boxing game. There never was a time in the entire contest when the Californian had a chance. He was simply a chopping block for the champion.
Now, to prepare for Stanley Ketchel, Johnson and his entourage took over several rooms on the second floor of the Seal Rock House, which is a hotel overlooking Ocean Beach. Now, rumours did surface that Johnson and Ketchel used the Seal Rock House to practice a fix. Both fighters denied the claims, but it would seem likely that they may have begun to rehearse the fight out before they decided against the idea. Now, Johnson had both Bell and Hattie stay with him at the Grand Hotel, and Johnson remembered them not getting along. Naturally, there was a state of warfare between Hattie and Bell, which threatened to break out into open and disastrous hostilities at any moment. I slipped in and out of the hotel in a manner that would have aroused newspaper reporters to much excited speculation had they known any of my manoeuvres. Now, Hattie eventually moved out after a few days. Now, both fighters, as in Johnson and Ketchel, agreed to receive 60% of the gross receipts, of which Johnson got 65% and Ketchel got 35%. They also agreed to split 40% of the proceeds for the films of this fight, and each boxer posted a forfeit of $5,000 to go as a side bet. Now, Ketchel wanted the fight to be scheduled for 45 rounds, but Johnson insisted on a 20-round bout. Now, although that fix that we mentioned earlier was off the table, Johnson did agree to let Ketchel make a good showing for at least 12 of the rounds. The fight was originally scheduled to take place on October the 12th, but it was moved back 4 days. The promoter, Jim Kaufman, changed the date for business reasons, saying Saturday was a better day than Tuesday to draw a crowd. Johnson was a 10-4 favourite to win, and even money to stop Ketchel in less than 15 rounds. There was a crowd of over 10,000, with 3,000 actually turned away at the gate.
The fight was pretty much how the Burns fight had gone, and Johnson was winning comfortably. But then midway through the 12th, Ketchel strayed from the script. He and his manager, Willis Britt, had evidently planned a double cross as Johnson set yet another long, lazy jab towards Ketchel's face. Britt shouted, "Now, Stanley, now!" And the middleweight champion lunged forward with an overhand right. It landed just behind the champion's left ear. Johnson's feet went from underneath him. Johnson came right back and hit him in the mouth so hard that with his right hand, that the force from the blow sent both men to the floor. Ketchel stayed there, flat on his back. 4 of his teeth flew across the canvas. The crowd fell silent as the referee counted him out. Johnson stood, one arm along the top rope, the other on his hip, peering down anxiously for some sign that his opponent would revive. It took several minutes until Ketchel recovered his senses. Attentions quickly turned to Johnson versus Jeffries.
Now, footage of that actually can be seen. There is some great black and white footage of that moment where Johnson does get dropped and comes right back and absolutely sparks Stanley Ketchel. Definitely worth a quick look on YouTube. Now, on the afternoon of October the 29th, 1909, in the banquet hall of New York's Albany Hotel on Broadway, Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries met face to face for the first time in 4 years. Once they both sat at their press conference table, Jeffries slapped his $5,000 bet on the table. Johnson came up with just $2,500. It was all he had in the world, he said. They had previously agreed to a $5,000 side bet on the outcome of the fight, and in the end the bet was shelved, but they did agree to fight for the 45 rounds on July the 4th, 1910, at a site still to be chosen. Now, the winner was to get 75% of the winnings, the loser 25%, although that actually changed by fight time. The split eventually would be 60-40. Now, with 9 months left until the fight, Johnson continued with his normal affairs. He met 2 significant people that would later become prominent in his life. Another female, called Etta Terry Duea, and promoter Tex Rickard, who had a proposition to make. Now, while sitting with Johnson and Bell in their hotel, the promoter pitched his offer, a $101,000 purse, the largest in boxing history, 2/3 of the film rights to be split between the fighters, a bonus of $5,000 more for Johnson on signing, and $2,500 in cash that very afternoon, with another $2,500 before he entered the ring. And, as a further incentive, the finest sealskin coat he could find for Mrs. Johnson. Now, without even talking with George Little, Johnson signed up. Rickard then discovered that a promoter named Jack Gleason had made a similar secret arrangement with Sam Berger, and Jeffries had already accepted a signing bonus of $10,000, twice the sum Rickard had promised Johnson. Now, to keep the scheme afloat, Rickard agreed to become Gleason's partner and pledged a second $5,000 bonus for Johnson, so that both fighters were treated equally.
Johnson and Jeffries attended the Myers Hotel in Hoboken, New Jersey on November 30th to make it look like they were interested in other bids to promote that fight. But both, as you mentioned, Sean, had already agreed in secret who they wanted. So it was just a matter of making Tex Rickard and Jack Gleason. They got the formal approval. Now, Rickard originally picked San Francisco on July 4th to stage the fight, where he and Gleason built a brand new stadium on 8th and Market Streets to seat the 30,000 customers they were confident would pay to see the contest they had began to bill as the real battle of the century. Both fighters participated in vaudeville acts to promote the fight. This is where Johnson met a small-time theatrical impresario named Barney Gerard. Johnson agreed to tour different cities arranged by Gerard, and in return, he would be paid handsomely, $1,300 a week. By now, Johnson began introducing Etta as the new Mrs. Jack Johnson. He also got the chance to finally catch up with his mum at Christmas, and the press took shots of their reunion. His wife for the day was Hattie. A couple of days later, Belle brought some unexpected news for Johnson that she was pregnant with his baby. After a few days, it would be established that Belle either miscarried, she aborted, or she just basically lied about the whole thing. Her gamble to be the number one Mrs. Jack Johnson had backfired, with Johnson moving Etta into his mum's house. It wasn't long before Belle left Johnson after he apparently beat her up. Whether that's true or not, we definitely not quite sure. He definitely beat up a patron at a bar though, and was arrested and charged for assault. And following a payment of $1,500, he was bailed when the victim didn't show up for court. Johnson was locked up for 5 hours and ordered to pay $5,000 to be released. Now, the woman who managed the Little Savoy, where the incident actually happened, actually paid the bond. Not long after, Johnson allegedly pulled a gun out on a certain Sam Langford during a dispute. It was a turbulent couple of months for Jack. But he moved on. He caught up with Etta. He patched things up with Bell. And with the tour approaching its end, Johnson found out that Gerard had shortchanged him. So he cornered the guy in the manager's office, and he threatened to kill him if he didn't hand over $250. No one was going to exploit Jack Johnson if he could help it. Gerard said, "See, my life was in danger. I handed him the money." Then he filed a suit of breach of contract against Jack Johnson.
Now, with only a few months left until Johnson versus Jeffries, he was continually ridiculed by the press, but not just the white, this time also by the black press. The Indianapolis Freeman, who were closely allied with Booker T. Washington, wrote, "Johnson has shown no particular liking for the coloured race. The cold hand of the law is reaching out for Mr. Johnson, and it looks to take the leading role in his future conduct. Why shouldn't it, when the lives, liberty and happiness of over 9 million Negroes are being antagonised and jeopardised by his folly? If you don't believe it, Holler hooray for Jack Johnson in the hearing of any group of white men and see how much trouble you'll have. Now on March the 31st, Johnson had a party to celebrate his 32nd birthday. He and his mate, Sig Hart, decided to take 2 sports cars out for a race. Now Johnson, he was pulled over on a regular basis by the police, sometimes because he was genuinely speeding, but some just because he was black. And the police felt like a black man did not have the right to drive around in such a flash car. Now on this particular day, Johnson stuck a sign on his windshield that read, "Please don't pinch me today, I am not speeding, believe me." Now of course, it didn't work. He was stopped, and they were both arrested. Now, there is a great story that's done the rounds for a number of years, and it's a number of photos that you see on social media with this quote on about it. And it's obviously around the time Johnson and his love of cars and his constant harassment of the police was going on. And the story is that Johnson was tearing down the main street of a little town, and a policeman pulled him over and he said, "What's the matter, officer?" "Boy, you're going way too fast. I've got to fine you." Jack Johnson asked, "How much?" Policeman says $50. So Johnson reached into his pocket and he pulls out a roll of $100 bills and he hands one to the officer. And the officer says, "What are you doing?" "I can't change up 100. Keep the change, officer, because I am coming back just as fast as the way I went through."
Brilliant. Absolutely class from Jack Johnson. Love it. Not long before the Jeffries fight, Johnson and Little parted ways, his other manager, George Little. Johnson said that his manager was trying to get him to take a dive because the money was better for all concerned. Little says he was being forced out by his other friend, Sig Hart, who was being poised to take his place. Whatever the reason, they severed ties completely after an altercation at a hotel when Johnson kicked Little out. Little told the press, "I am no Sam Fitzpatrick. He can't do this to me. I will manage Johnson or there will be no fight." He did have a contract entitling him to a quarter of the champion's earnings and demanded that he be paid back the $10,000 he said he had put up as forfeit. He was also spotted stalking up and down Market Street, and Johnson recalled showing his pistol to everybody and shouting that I'd robbed him. "When I learned of this, I got in my car, I drove there, intending to punch him on the nose." The police kept them apart. After a quick legal battle, Johnson sacked Little legitimately and hired veteran trainer Tom Flanagan to oversee any business matters he couldn't handle on his own. Now, Little finally accepted the defeat and reportedly bet against Johnson in the fight that was coming up against Jeffries. And the referee was decided as Tex Rickard. Once again, the promoter who had never refereed a fight in his life, agreed to step in. Johnson was convinced that this would give him a fair shake at the fight, just like Hugh McIntosh was in the fight against Tommy Burns.
Now, on June the 25th, 1910, the White Slave Traffic Act, also called the Mann Act, was introduced. Now, it was a United States federal law that was meant to combat forced prostitution and debauchery, or for any other immoral purposes. Now, because it lacked specificity, it criminalised many who were not participating in prostitution. It became a way to persecute large numbers of unmarried couples participating in premarital or extramarital activities, especially when it involved crossing state lines. Now, this act will, of course, become an issue for Jack Johnson, but not quite now, maybe in another 2 years' time. Now, as the fight approached, many indicated that the fight would be a fix. Even John L. Sullivan, again, had his 10 pence and he told the New York Times the bout was likely a frame-up. And California's governor, J.N. Gillette, agreed, and he said, "This Jeffries-Johnson fight is simply a scheme to make a lot of money out of the credulity of the public." Now, if talk of a fix wasn't bad enough, the Methodist Preachers Association of Philadelphia declared that this fight can be regarded as nothing less than a national disgrace and calamity to the moral life of our people, and appealed to President Taft to intervene and stop this fight from happening. But the Reverend Reverdy Ranson, an activist, an AME pastor from New York, countered their appeals of national disgrace, perfectly saying, "Is a prize fight more revolting and atrocious than those lynching and burnings which are of much too frequent occurrence?" In the end, California Governor James Norris Gillette, who apparently assumed the fight was just an exhibition, barred the fight from his state, ordering his Attorney General to tell Rickard to get out of my state, telling to take Johnson and Jeffries with him. What he is planning is a prize fight, and it is against the law.
With the fight now in jeopardy, Rickard had less than 3 weeks to find a new town willing to host the fight. He had to disassemble his brand new stadium and ship it to the new site and put it all together again by July 4th. Rickard must have had a backup plan because he was so quick to identify Nevada, the most open-minded state in America. He met with the governor, Denver S. Dickinson, who had only one question for Rickard. He said, "Tell me, man to man, is it on a level, Tex?" Rickard promised it will be the squarest fight ever pulled off. And with that, the fight was back on. Rickard chose Reno over Goldfield due to its better transport links by train and boat. Now, in the days leading up to the bout, Johnson had an open door to all reporters and fans and played up to the crowds. He impressed Governor Dickinson and said, "I have never seen a man who can whip Jack Johnson as he stands today. I am forced to bet on him." When John L. Sullivan asked Johnson what kind of shape he was in, he answered, "Captain Tom, if I felt any better, I'd be afraid of myself." Brilliant. Jeffries, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He kept everything private and wasn't interested in showing off to the public. He may not have said much to the press in the days before the fight, but on the eve of the fight, he was in confident mood, in public anyway, saying, "I realise full well what depends on me. That portion of the white race that has been looking for me to defend its athletic superiority may feel assured that I am fit to do my very best and I will win as quickly as I can." On the morning of the fight, 13 specially arranged trains pulled into Reno, Nevada. Aboard were thousands of white men, pretty much predominantly all white, who had all travelled all around the country to watch a fight like no other had ever seen before. They had to come to see their hero, the ex-heavyweight champion of the world, Jim Jeffries, take back the title from Jack Johnson. The Chicago Tribune wrote it was going to be a contest between the white man's hope and the black peril. He later said, "I'll win in the first round." He, as in this is Jim Jeffries, "I'll win in the first round with one punch if possible." And Jack Johnson responded, "I will bring home the bacon. I'll wear him down."
Now, as thousands piled in to the makeshift stadium, Johnson became concerned that he might get attacked by the predominantly white spectators, so he asked Jeffries himself to issue an appeal to his fans to remain calm whatever took place in the ring. Jeffries obliged, and he said, "I would consider any move to intimidate Johnson as cowardly and a disgrace to the American spirit of fair play. I expect to whip him and then shake his hand. If Johnson should by any chance win, though, he must not be harmed. I demand this." The betting favourite was 10-6 for Jeffries, with Johnson the underdog. Now, although the fight was illegal across America, there was huge interest in the fight. 30,000 New Yorkers gathered in Times Square, where giant bulletin boards had been set up on 3 sides of the New York Times building to provide details as soon as they started coming in from ringside. The San Francisco Examiner set up a ring high above the street and hired 2 boxers, one black and one white, to reenact the whole fight, punch by punch, for the thousands of people below. And in Chicago, 5,000 black men and women anxiously took their seats at the peaking, the most elegant black-owned theatre in the country. In the crowd were many of the sport's biggest stars, promoters and managers, which included John L. Sullivan, Bob Fitzsimmons, Tommy Burns, Tom Sharkey, Hugh McIntosh, Stanley Ketchel, Tom McCary, Jim Kofforth, Bill Lang, Sam Langford, Battling Nelson, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, and many, many more, all people that have been affiliated with these two men. Now, after a long delay, Jack Johnson made his way to the ring at 2:30, wearing a black and white silk bathrobe. He was booed, but he was also amazed at the number of well-wishers I had. And he said, I heard many cheers. That's more than what took place in Australia, where my entry brought lusty boos and hisses. Now, as Jeffries made his way to the ring, with Jim Corbett leading him out, the crowd in attendance all stood and applauded and cheered their hero. Even Johnson joined in with the clapping while he waited in the ring. And Jack London captured both men's demeanour perfectly when he wrote, Johnson unaffected joke with his seconds. The man of summer temperament smiled and smiled, while the man of iron, the grizzly giant, was grim and serious.
Brilliant. Many expected Jeffries to charge at Johnson in the opening round, but he did the complete opposite. Much of it was clinching and trying to use his extra 19 pounds to wear Johnson down. It didn't work. Johnson recalled that the opening round made him sure that he would get the victory. I was feeling quite fresh and going easy, able to hit when I wanted to, and I could tell he wasn't going to beat me for strength. Jim Corbett, who was in Jeffries' corner, he was there to basically rear up Jack Johnson. He shouted insults at Jack in hope that he would just piss him off. Racial slurs, stuff about his mum, whatever he could think of, he just wanted to try and wind him up and just to take his mind off the fight. It didn't work. Corbett just looked like an angry, racist white man that was close to having a heart attack. And Johnson, he didn't allow Jeffries any room to throw anything. He countered everything with his faster hands and clinched when he wanted to. While in the clinch, he would talk to the crowd and Jeffries. He'd say, come on, Jeff, let me see what you got. Do something, man. This is for the championship. Johnson continued to slowly batter Jeffries. He could have stopped it at any time he wanted, but he knew that a quick knockout would it incensed the huge white crowd that followed Jeffries. And by the end of the 14th, Jeffries' nose was broken. His eyes were swollen shut. His shoulders and thighs were laced with blood. You can see the foot. You can see the pictures of it. It's in black and white, but you can see it. He was desperately tired. He was seated on his stool between rounds, gasping for air. And he told his seconds he could hardly lift his arms. Everyone knew what was coming, but they sent him out for that 15th round anyway. Jeffries went down for the first time in his career from a flurry of punches. He was able to get up at the count of 9, but Johnson sent him through the ropes with a right hand to the jaw. His seconds and reporters had to help him back into the ring. Jeffries then staggered across the canvas, where a combination put him down for the last time. Johnson stood over him, ready to strike should he manage to rise to his feet. Rickard shoved Johnson back and began the count. Jeffries' seconds had seen enough. Sam Berger stepped through the ropes and stopped the fight. Bob Armstrong threw in a towel. Rickard grabbed Johnson's shoulder to sign that he was the winner. The crowd stormed the ring, and Johnson's corner made a wall around their man to stop him from getting attacked. He wasn't too aggressive, but they were, you can see it, the footage is there. A load of them were flocking in and they didn't look happy.
Meanwhile, Jeffries, he wobbled back to his corner and he said, I couldn't come back, boys. He said over and over and over again, I couldn't come back. Johnson wasn't bothered and didn't hold back with his words, and he said, I could have fought for 2 hours longer. It was easy. Where is my lucky bathrobe? I'm going to give one of my gloves to Jeffries and the other to Corbett. I guess Jeff won't be so grouchy now. I was having lots of fun. Not one blow hurt me. He can't hit. He won't forget 2 punches I landed on him. He was only half the trouble Burns was. Now, the black Americans, of course, were all in a frenzy all over the country. They took to the streets, singing and dancing and drinking to Jack Johnson. They were now a race of champions, one jubilant fan said. That evening, Johnson and Etta and their entourage sped into Reno from Rick's Roadhouse to pick up the champions' earnings of $121,000, a sum that may have been larger than any black American had ever earned in a single day before. The money was nice, but the victory was even sweeter. But as predicted, Johnson's win was greeted with violence. The white people were bitter and sore, so they took it out on any black person who showed support. Now here, we've got 3 horrific instances that happened post-Johnson Jeffries. Now, there was a white passenger on a Houston streetcar who slit a black man's throat because he had dared to cheer for Johnson. There was whites in Wheeling, West Virginia, came upon a black man driving a nice automobile. Now, as Jack Johnson was famous for doing that, they dragged him out of his car and hung him. Absolutely disgusting. Now, near Georgia, white riflemen opened fire on a black construction camp, killing 3 and wounding 5. There were many other sickening stories across the country in all states, where at least 11 and perhaps as many as 26 people would die before it was all said and done. Hundreds more was hurt, and almost all of them were black. That absolutely horrific. That's horrific. That is the sign of that time that Jack Johnson would beat Jeffries to retain his world heavyweight title, and because their hopes were poured so much into Jeffries, this was their retaliation for their man not being able to deliver. Absolutely disgraceful.
Oh, it's just disturbing. Just the thought of it, that poor man getting dragged out of his car and getting hung. I mean, it's over a fight. I mean, so what? It's just a fucking fight. It makes no sense, and it's just grim reading. So Johnson was heartbroken when hearing of these horrific ordeals that his people were suffering. Now, while still on the train back from Reno heading east, he was greeted by all colours at every stop, all to congratulate him. Although there were the odd few mad white rednecks that tried to attack him, again, he just brushed it off. He told a reporter, "Just because my black fists happen to be many for a pair of white fists," he said sadly. "If both colours knew the real Jack Johnson, they'd behave themselves like he does." And then he continued to say that the fellows that are making trouble over my victory at Reno ain't no class. They're only scum. Now, you've got to make him right there. They're worse than scum. Now, upon arrival at home in Galveston, he was greeted to a large gathering at his mother's house. The next day, he deposited more than $100,000 in the First Trust and Savings Bank. Then he bought a $3,000 car for his mum and wired a total of $4,000 to 8 friends in Galveston. 4 had been members of the old 11th Street and the Avenue K gang. We spoke about that in the first part. And $750 went to Ed Harrison, according to Los Angeles Examiner. That was his old-time trainer who taught Johnson how to fight on the docks. He also brought him 2 suits that he had promised him when he was a youngster. He said he'd be world champion. He would do that for him. He'd done that to demonstrate the hatred some felt towards Johnson. He was getting dressed for another night of celebration when he was noticed by a white man with a rifle out of his window, walking up to his mum's house. He called the police. The police arrived, and the man was arrested. He turned out to be a drunken Canadian-born mechanic from St. Louis named Richard McGurk, who had lost his savings betting on Jim Jeffries. His weapon was unloaded when he was seized, but the police believed he had come to town to kill Johnson. Unbelievably, Jack Johnson did not press any charges.
Now, while in New York, Johnson was greeted by an even larger crowd at Grand Central. He then invited a young Nat Fleischer, the future boxing historian and founding editor of The Ring, who was then working for the New York Sun Press, up to his hotel room for an interview. Now, as the 2 men wound up their interview, Etta emerged unexpectedly from the bathroom, and Fleischer remembered. She had been preparing for the evening celebrations, having no idea that Jack was entertaining a guest in the living room. She was completely nude. Embarrassed and furious at Johnson for failing to warn that he was not alone, she began to shout at him. Fleischer also went on to say, Jack tried to explain, but he was actually cut short when his wife, her eyes were blazing menacingly, she raised a chair. Discretion being the better part of valour, this seemed to both of us the impromptu moment to leave. The chair caught Jack in the centre of the back as we raced down the stairs with her curses flooding after us. Now, when the film footage was ready to be released to the public, many important figures, all white, including former President Theodore Roosevelt, they all gathered together to ban them being shown in theatres. Their reasoning behind this was to prevent more race bias and stop black Americans from thinking they were better than the white race. Even the British Empire banned them from Britain and from their other colonies, which included India. Eventually, the films were shown without incident in several large cities in the USA, which included Kansas City, Missouri, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and Hoboken, New Jersey.
Crazy, trying to ban them. Wow, it's just crazy these times. So Johnson didn't see the need to return to the ring because there were no worthy white challengers for his title. There were certainly black ones. He was correct. There weren't no white challengers out there. The only guys that were around were the black challengers, and obviously we weren't interested. Those guys were Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, and Sam McVeigh. Trouble was, he knew that those three black heavyweights in particular would have caused him great difficulty, especially Langford, who he drew his own colour line. He drew his own colour line against Langford, clear as day. During this time away from the ring, he continued to tour around the country, but then attempted to become a race driver. He actually challenged one of the best race drivers in the country, a guy called Barney Oldfield. But after much hype and self-belief, he was quite literally left in the dirt and beaten by some distance. It was enough to make Johnson realise that he was no race driver at all. But he also helped fund Belle. This is an important moment as well. He helped fund Belle, who was his other girlfriend, sometimes a Mrs. Jack Johnson, to start her own sporting house, handing over $196,000 plus $500 extra to buy further equipment. So it's just to help her start her business. He even moved into politics to support Alderman Tom McManus, known as the McManus, and Thomas G. Patton, the Democratic candidate for Congress. Although he would switch sides depending on which government were acting on behalf of the black people, plus the money, of course, was right. Johnson campaigned on behalf of Edward H. Wright, who was a Republican, and then he switched sides again, becoming the first. This guy was the first black candidate for alderman in Chicago. So he went into politics. He's helping people. He's helping his missus out to start a business up, and he's doing everything but fight at the minute.
Johnson would spend exactly 2 years out of the ring after the Jeffries fight, and he had begun to drink more than normal, and later admitted, I was not myself for a year after the Jeffries fight. He sometimes claimed to have suffered from what he called brain fever. Now, while on his usual tour of punching the bag, sparring and speaking to the crowd, he forgot his lines. Johnson said, I couldn't seem to understand what was going on. He said afterwards, he ran off stage, frightened and agitated, poured cold water over his head to cool down, and gave his gun to Etta, telling her to keep it away from him, as something told me I might do harm with it. Now, a couple of days later, he felt woozy after drinking a beer, and was convinced that someone had tried to poison him, exactly what he later thought George Little had done before the Jeffries fight. Now, he spent a night in a medical facility for long-term illness, and the New York Times reported that friends fear he has fought his last battle by the rapid pace at which he has been living. Now, he tried to be reassuring after he was released, and he said, I'm alright, except that sometimes I don't know what is going on around me. Now, he was released too soon in Portland, Maine. He broke down again, refusing to go on stage and threatened suicide. Now, if Etta hadn't been with him, he said, and willing to nurse him day and night, he probably would have hung himself, or leaped from the window of his room. The hotel doctor was called, and he diagnosed Johnson to be suffering from aggravated nervous exhaustion.
So Etta had grown quite fond of Johnson's French driver, Gaston Lafont, and he had been that comfort and that shoulder to cry on while Johnson continued to be unfaithful to her. Now, in the end, they fell in love. Johnson had his suspicions, so he hired a detective to follow him. And his suspicions were confirmed when they were spotted several times together. Somewhere along the line, Etta ended up in hospital after being beaten up. Johnson said it was Gaston, but it would be more than likely that the chances are, by what we guess from accounts, is that Johnson or someone that Johnson had hired had probably given Etta a bit of a hiding. Now, Etta blamed no one for her condition, telling the doctor that she had hurt herself falling from a streetcar. And she never deviated from that story. Now, while Etta was in hospital, Gaston showed up at Johnson's house in Chicago with a gun, threatening to kill him. The police were called and the Frenchman was arrested. He was released after a couple of days, during which time Johnson went to visit him for a chat. But no one ever knows quite what was said between the two guys. Then on the afternoon of January 18, 1911, Johnson and Etta were officially married. Tiny Johnson and her daughters were never keen on Etta. They were convinced that Johnson was being conned and she was only interested in marriage for his money. Now, with Belle now settled into her new business, or as we thought, Johnson contacts Hattie and paid her $500, more than $9,000 in today's money, for all the pictures and the letters that he had sent to her over the years for her silence. No more talking to the press. He then turned down Hugh McIntosh for his offer of 60% of $30,000 to fight Langford. Johnson's continued speeding eventually caught up with him when Judge A.B. Treadwell cited the fact that Johnson had been arrested at least 14 times on similar charges and sentenced him to 25 days in a county jail of Ingleside. He was released after 18 days due to good behaviour, with the promise that he is not caught speeding again. The irony is, while he was in Manhattan, Johnson was arrested, but this time for driving too slow. Johnson told the press, "Pinch me again. If I go too fast, they arrest me. And now it seems like if I go too slow, they do the same. Next thing, somebody will arrest me for being a brunette in a blonde town."
It's a great little story there. I absolutely love it. It's hilarious. Now, on June the 5th, 1911, Mr. and Mrs. Jack Johnson set sail for England. With them went a chauffeur named Charles Brown and two sparring partners, Monty Cutler and Walter Monaghan, as well as a pair of racing cars, 20 trunks, and a small safe containing Johnson's cash and his wife's jewels. They arrived in Plymouth to several press and fans, and they were reported in the papers every day, and fans, mostly female, would gather outside his flat near Shaftesbury Avenue. Johnson and Etta attended the coronation of King George in Piccadilly on June the 23rd. Johnson then signed with a British promoter named James White to fight Britain's best heavyweight, an Indian Army veteran named Billy Wells, at the Empress Theatre at Earl's Court. First, though, he had to do his usual shows for crowds, a lot like the ones in America. Etta would stay in a grand hotel and have a car for her any time she wanted to go out, but she actually fell into a depression. Now, when Johnson would return, they would argue and fight, and the neighbours would complain, and items would be broken in their rented accommodation. Johnson suddenly cancelled his theatrical tour, telling the press his wife was suffering such great nervous prostration that the attending physicians fear for her life. They moved on to Paris instead, and Johnson said, where he would train while staying close to her bedside. What many didn't actually know was that she had tried or threatened to actually hurl herself from the window of their hotel room, so life on the road and life with Jack Johnson didn't seem as rosy as what it must have first come across.
Yeah, I think they're both having real trouble, aren't they? Mentally here, moving just the fast life. I think they're struggling with it. Now they moved to Paris, even though Etta didn't want to go, according to her mother, who said that she had told her she'd rather die than go. That's what her mother said. They still went, and Johnson was treated like royalty. He loved it in Paris. But with Etta's mental health deteriorating, they moved to the suburbs, and Johnson reluctantly returned home every night. It wasn't long before they crossed the channel back to England to prepare for the Wales fight. But just like in America, many appealed the fight, using the race as an issue. Johnson was disgusted. English preachers knew nothing about boxing, he said, and even less about black people. Boxing simply pitted one individual against another. It had nothing to do with race. On September 20, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself wrote to Winston Churchill, urging him to halt the fight. The bishops of London, Oxford, Ripon, Durham echoed the call. They were joined by Sir Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, as well as Lord Mayor of London, and the headquarters of the Rugby, Dulwich, Mill Hill and Tooting schools. Then, on September 24, Churchill, he gave in. And he said, I have made my mind up to stop the Wells-Johnson contest. This is what apparently he told his wife the terms are utterly unsupporting and unfair. The director of the public prosecutions promptly took out summons against Johnson and Wells, their managers, and the promoter James White. All five were ordered to appear at the Bow Street Court of Summary Jurisdiction to answer the Home Secretary's charge that they planned a breach of peace. Apparently, Johnson was disgusted, as he just shocked. There was a long drawn-out court case, but while the magistrates' court had been in session, the London Metropolitan Railroad, which owned the land on the Empress Theatre where it stood, had persuaded the High Court to issue an injunction against the promoters and the contest. There basically would be no championship fight between Johnson and Wells, and that was the end of that.
Now, Johnson and Etta went between England and Paris for a further 3 months before arriving in New York 3 days before Christmas, bringing with them an English valet and some secretary named Joseph Levy, Charles Brown, their American chauffeur, plus a Pomeranian named Baby, 3 cars, 14 trunks, and a mountain of debt. Now, although Johnson was quick to squash those rumours, he said, I can write a check any day in the week for $100,000. Besides this, I have property in the way of automobiles and jewellery. I value my cars at $25,000 and jewellery at $60,000, and I have a few £1,000s in my pocket. Outside of that, I'm kind of shy. Now, irrelevant of Johnson's play, he was desperate to return to the ring for only one reason, and that was the money. Now, since he had defeated Jeffries, there had been a desperate search for the next white hope. All men that were over 6 foot tall and weighed over 200 pounds were put through their paces in hope that they could unearth a viable challenger. They hadn't succeeded, but the best hopes were fireman Jim Flynn, who Johnson had knocked out 5 years earlier, and Carl Morris. Now, to decide who best to match with Johnson, the two fought, and Flynn won in what Los Angeles Times called the bloodiest fight ever seen in this city. Carl Morris's career as a serious contender ended, and Jim Flynn's was reborn. His promoter, Jack Curley, managed to wrangle his way into meeting Johnson through newspaper articles and interviews. In the end, Johnson was offered $30,000, the sum Tommy Burns had insisted on fighting him, plus $1,100 for travel and training expenses and 1/3 of the film rights for a 45-round contest to be held on July the 4th, 1912, 2 years to the day after Reno. And of course, Johnson eagerly accepted.
So with a fight in the horizon and money coming in again with many tours, it seemed like Johnson's luck was due to change. But when the press got wind of his marriage to Etta, things began to change again. Police would arrive at his door with a warrant for a $2,000 diamond necklace that Johnson had bought for Etta and smuggled through customs without detection. If he had not bragged about it to strangers, then no one would have been none the wiser, but typical Jack Johnson, he loved to talk. Instead, the Johnsons now faced smuggling charges and a court date was set for July. Definitely is not going to help their mental health for the minute. Then on the night of his first appearance on tour, Etta tried to kill herself, this time by swallowing carbolic acid. A doctor was called, her stomach was pumped, and she recovered. While driving around Cincinnati, a man punched Jack Johnson in the face but wasn't arrested. When in Pittsburgh, a truck rammed into his car and Johnson actually flew out of it onto the ground, pulling tendons in his back. On doctor's orders, he had to postpone the start of his training schedule for the Jim Flynn fight. By the time he arrived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the fight was due to take place, Flynn had already been training for 3 weeks with Tommy Ryan installed as his new trainer. Johnson used a young and fresh Harry Wills to spar with, and he remembers one session in the hot sun. So this is Harry Wills. I was still growing, but I already had a right hand to the body that I thought I could hit anybody with. I was working with Johnson one day, and sure enough, I nailed him. I got cocky, and in the next round, I tried the same thing. Old Jack reached down and caught my fist like you catch a ball and grinned at his wife, who was sitting at ringside. And it wasn't long before Johnson received his first death threats while in New Mexico. An anonymous note signed KKK telling Johnson to lie down or we'll string you up. He tucked a gun under his pants and hired an armed guard to patrol the yard at night, just as he had done in Reno.
Now, Johnson entered the ring against Flynn 25 pounds heavier than he was when he faced Jeffries. The outdoor stadium built was supposed to hold 17,950 fans. Carpenters were still putting the finishing touches on the arena while the fans were actually entering, but Jack Curley misjudged the fight's intrigue, as only a crowd of actually 4,500 turned out for it. Now, there's no surprise as to why the fight didn't capture the boxing fans' imagination, because it was a one-sided victory for Johnson, just as many had predicted. The referee Edward Smith repeatedly warned Flynn for headbutting, and Smith said, "I was about to disqualify him," and gave the contest to the champion when the state police burst into the ring and declared the thing at an end. Smith awarded it to Johnson on a foul. It is suggested that Johnson received only $21,000 of the $31,000 he was promised, but other sources suggest he earned $31,100 before he'd even entered the ring, and another $5,000 from betting on himself. Now, the promotion was not successful for Jack Curley, who said, "I stand to lose about $15,000 of my own money." Johnson, Etta, and their entourage made their way back to Chicago with their winnings, but once again, it almost ended in disaster. Etta tried to jump to her death from the window of their speeding car, but Johnson managed to catch her. Once they arrived in Chicago, Johnson was beginning to realise that he won't be around forever, and he told a visitor at his home, "I've got sense enough to know that the old Dame Nature is going to take the speed and strength away from Jack Johnson, the same as she did to Sullivan, Jeffries, and the rest of them. When a man gets to my age, the training grind gets to be too much of a strain."
I think that and Etta losing, sort of going the other way here, isn't helping. I can see why he's thinking, I'm going to end it, just carry on without boxing. So, but anyway, on July 10, 1912, Johnson opened his Café de Champion on the 241st West 31st Street between Armour Avenue and Dearborn Street in Chicago. Now, with help from several silent partners, including the Hellman Brewing Company, which supplied the cafe's beer, there was nothing quite like the three-story night spot that accommodated the black and white race to drink, eat, and dance together. It was the only one around that actually had interracial. You can just have fun together, no problem. Each new customer received a free 32-page souvenir program that explained what it called the why and wherefore of his establishment. In this lengthy tribute, it explains Johnson's many sides to the champion's wits, musicianship, his skills as a swimmer, a horseman, a wrestler, an automobile driver. The rest was full of advertisements for his endorsements, like the car he drove to the cigar he smoked. Other stuff included the love he had for his mother, big fight details. He also plugged his friends' casinos and restaurants. The Café de Champion was meant to be the headquarters for the Johnsons, him and his wife, where he would live with Etta and in their elegantly furnished third floor apartment. So it's on the top of the first and second floor. I think you had like a restaurant below, and the second floor was like a disco and a band. Being in a big city and owning such a grand cafe came at a risk, so he had to pay $1,000 a week protection money to keep mobsters away. Johnson, though, was unable to keep away from the women. He had a secret room where many girls would visit him through the night while Etta's upstairs. Two ladies in particular captured Johnson's attention. It was Ada Banks and Lucille Cameron. Ada Smith, aka Bricktop, remembers Ada Banks, same name, being a good-looking, brown-skinned girl with lovely voice, and Lucille Cameron was a pretty blonde 18-year-old from Minneapolis.
Now, not long after the opening of his cafe, Johnson and Etta found themselves in court on the smuggling of a diamond necklace into the country charges. They were released on a $500 bail, but then Johnson was arrested for assaulting the chauffeur Charles Brown because he refused to inform him what he had told the police. His bail for the assault charge was $5,000. Now, by September the 11th, 1912, Etta had fallen into an even deeper depression. He had written a note to her mother explaining how unwell she felt. She felt isolated in the top floor of a cafe, was aware of Johnson's cheating, was disliked by the whites for being with Jack, and did not feel respected by the black community. That evening, she took a revolver to her temple while the club was in full swing, and she shot herself. By the time Johnson arrived, she was still breathing, but eventually died at Providence Hospital about 3 a.m. Johnson spoke to a reporter following Etta's suicide, and he said, "Yes, she was lonesome. We were both a little lonesome, I guess. But God, how we loved each other, and how lonesome I am now." Etta was buried 3 days later. Only a few weeks later, Johnson was seen linking arms with the new Mrs. Jack Johnson, Lucille Cameron, wearing Etta's jewellery and a fur coat.
Wow.
It's pretty
terrible.
shocking.
It really is, isn't it?
Now, Johnson seemed to be in a buoyant mood, excited about returning to the ring once again. In an interview with the Chicago Press, he said that he had signed for 3 fights overseas. First, he had planned to go to Australia, where Hugh McIntosh had guaranteed him $55,000 to fight Sam Langford in Sydney on Boxing Day, the 4th anniversary of his victory over Tommy Burns. Then he would take on Sam McVeigh in an Australian city to be chosen on a date to be decided. Now, once he'd disposed of those two, he thought he'd go to Paris, where Jack Curley wanted him to face fireman Jim Flynn for a 3rd time. Following that, he'd come back to the States and he'd then take on the latest Great White Hope, who was Luther McCarty. Curley, of course, he would promote that contest too. Now, Curley was his friend, Johnson said, and since he had lost money promoting the second Flynn contest in New Mexico, it was only fair to give him a chance to get it back. Johnson was now ready to set sail with Lucille by his side for the end of October. But Mrs. Cameron Falconet arrived, Lucille's mother, to stop her. She found Johnson and he drove her to see Lucille. They spent some time talking things over. She asked her to come home with her, but she refused before telling her mother she had to make a phone call. She went downstairs and disappeared. Lucille's mother did not accept her refusal, so hired Charles E. Erbstein, who specialised in murder and divorce, to track her down. They were set on ruining Jack Johnson, so they went to the police, claiming that he'd actually kidnapped Lucille. When the police pointed out to them that the young woman was over 18 and was therefore no way they could force her to leave him if she didn't want to. So the two went straight to the newspapers, and she told the press how she was under the spell of the heavyweight champion. In her words, she explained that Jack Johnson had hypnotic powers and he exercised them on my little girl. Now, when she had confronted her daughter's captor and begged him to give her up. She claimed he had cruelly taunted her as well. It was all a load of rubbish, of course, but the press, they printed the story anyway. Anything to have a dig at Johnson, they would happily lap it up.
They would, and Miss Cameron Falconet, she was a piece of work. She actually went on to say that, I'm appealing to all of Chicago to help me. It does not seem possible that such things could happen in Chicago, or that white men could see their civilization so outraged. After reading in the news that the police were looking for Lucille, Johnson brought Lucille in a taxi to the Harrison Street Annex, the city jail. She was, of course, unscathed. In fact, she was very well dressed and she looked the part. She looked very well looked after. Once she had composed herself, she was crying quite intensely. She told the Captain Nootbar that she had fallen for Jack Johnson. She was in love with Jack and hoped that one day she would become his wife. Now, her mother was absolutely disgusted and appalled. And she said, I would rather see you spend a life in jail than one day in the company of that, we'll bleep that, N, I should say. Lucille was held in a cell and Johnson was ready to pay for her bail. But to stop this from happening, Epstein quickly persuaded another judge to order Lucille's detention until her sanity could be examined. It's just fucking crazy. Only a deranged white girl who argued and could believe herself to be in love with Jack Johnson, and the judge agreed. Johnson went back to his cafe to find Ada Banks. This is the other girl that we spoke about, waiting for him. She had left her husband and she wanted to be the new Jack Johnson. He told her that Lucille was his girl and not her. What did she do? Well, she pulled out a gun. There was an argument and some suggest that shots were fired, or a shot was fired before she fled the scene. A rumor surfaced that Johnson had been shot, but only in the foot. And when the press asked her, once they caught up with her, if she shot Johnson, she said, I didn't do quite that.
What an absolute crazy time. He's got so many bloody women on the go and all these crazy people around. It's absolutely unbelievable. Now, the Justice Department had targeted Johnson for possible violation of the Mann Act almost from the moment it came into effect, and this was going to be the best opportunity to finally get him. It was later reported that Belle Schreiber was contacted in 1910 to confirm that she had travelled with him between states, but she denied it. A district attorney from Chicago, James H. Wilkerson, filed a case against Catherine Dorsey, the woman that had introduced Lucille to Jack Johnson for violating the Mann Act. Special Agent Mayer was hopeful that if they could prove that Dorsey was procuring girls for immoral purposes, then they would just need to prove that Johnson was willing to move her between the state lines, making it possible for a conviction. Lucille was confined to the Winnebago County Jail at Rockford as a material witness with a $25,000 bail, and only a mother could make contact with her, keeping Johnson well away. Then Lucille's mother and Charles Epstein appeared before a municipal judge and persuaded him to sign a warrant for Jack Johnson's arrest on a charge of abduction. He was arrested at home at 1 o'clock, but posted the $800 bail and was released the same day, but was forced to return to court the following day. Now, while in court, the judge raised Johnson's bail to $1,500 in cash. He left the court and headed to the bank, where he was greeted by an angry white mob. The enraged white men attempted to threaten Johnson, but nobody had the bottle to make the first move. The champ remained calm, but had to exit at the rear of the bank to avoid a confrontation. The Police Gazette called Johnson the vilest, most despicable creature that lives. He has disgusted the American public by flaunting it in their faces, an alliance as bold as it is offensive. Sam Sparks, the former state treasurer of the Lone Star State, called for 100 Texans to follow him north to Chicago to attend to Jack Johnson.
A team of lawyers worked against Johnson and were present at City Hall. Some that had been welcomed into the cafe and accepted his hospitality. Everyone was now against Johnson, white or black. it was he was officially the most hated man in America, and everyone or anyone that had been close to him severed ties almost immediately. Johnson was given his chance to address the court and spoke more sense than all these so-called educated judges, lawyers, or reporters. And he said, "I am not a slave, and I have the right to choose who my mate shall be without the dictation of any man. I have eyes and I have a heart, and when they fail to tell me who I shall have as mine, I want to be put away in the lunatic asylum. So long as I do not interfere with any other man's wife, I shall claim the right to select the woman of my choice. Nobody else can do that for me. That is where the trouble lies." Lucille took to the stand and explained that she had actually been a prostitute before she arrived in Chicago, and Johnson or nobody else had anything to do with her decision to work on the game. She continued to say that she loved him intensely and she still hoped that one day they could be together. She was sent to prison for more time to reflect in hope that she would change her mind.
Now, October the 28th, Mayor Harrison ordered Johnson to halt all music and entertainment at his cafe. 2 days later, the authorities put Johnson out of business altogether by refusing to renew his liquor license. To get it back, he would be required to prove he was of good moral character, and the mayor said he'll have a deuce of a time doing it if half the reports about him are true. Now, Johnson's treatment was disgusting. There were pimps, extortionists, murderers, thieves, and rapists who were much worse than Johnson. They owned clubs and held liquor licenses, but they were white, and their money was right. Now, these gangsters had more than likely entertained Mayor Harrison at some point. Johnson was not allowed to leave the States due to his smuggling trial. That was still pending, so he turned down the chance to fight Sam McVeigh in Paris. Plus, he didn't want to leave until Lucille was released from prison. Then things went from bad to worse when the Chicago office of the Bureau of Investigation got a tip-off. They managed to locate Belle Schreiber in Washington thanks to George Little, and another pissed-off former husband of another woman. Now, Belle was brought to Chicago, where she sang until the cows came home. She was able to produce receipts with dates of places she had been with Johnson, although many of the dates were before the Mann Act had come into fruition. But prosecutors, they began to build a case around these events in mid-October of 1910, when Johnson had paid Belle's rail fare from Pittsburgh to Chicago and then set her up as a madam at the Ridgewood Apartments. They basically got what they needed.
A grand jury voted to issue 7 Mann Act indictments against Jack Johnson, charging him with transporting her on October 15, 1910 from Pittsburgh to Chicago for the purpose of prostitution and debauchery and in violation of the peace and dignity of the United States. Within minutes, federal judge Kenshaw Mountain Landis issued a bench warrant for Johnson's immediate arrest. Bail was set for an unprecedented $30,000. Special Agent Mayer and a party of U.S. Marshals and city detectives arrested Johnson at the Hotel Vendome. He didn't resist arrest. While in court, Johnson offered to pay $65,000 in real estate and $15,000 in cash, but Judge Landis rejected. Johnson was refused bail and sent to Cook County Jail that evening. The county jail was strictly segregated, but it amused Johnson's prison officers to lead him to cell number 508 in the middle of the white section. There were over 50 white prisoners in the prison, and many cursed him as soon as he was spotted. Then they began to chant, "Hang Johnson, hang Johnson." After complaining that he was unwell, he spent the night at the infirmary. The next day, he was released and sent to the black side of the prison. Johnson's lawyer, Benjamin Backrach, W.G. Anderson, a specialist in habeas corpus cases. Habeas corpus is a writ requiring a person under arrest to be brought before a judge or into a court, especially to secure the person's release unless unlawful grounds were shown for the detention. That's the definition. And Johnson's friend, Edward H. Wright, the only black man to ever serve as president in the Cook County Board of Commissions, and still a force in the Republican Party. You know, these guys had leeway, they had power, and it took them only 1 week between the three of them to come up with the $30,000 that was acceptable for the government, and Johnson was released from prison on bail.
Now, while Bell was becoming impatient under police surveillance, Lucille was finally released from prison because she was being held immorally. Now, it wasn't long before she escaped her mother's clutches and arrived at Johnson's door, begging him to marry her. And eventually, that's what they did. Lucille had nothing to do with the case against Johnson, and as he explained, I had been blamed for ill-treating her, so we might as well be married right away. She is alone in the world now. Her mother has left her, and her stepfather is quoted as saying he wants to have nothing more to do with her. We love each other, and I see no reason why we should not be married. They tied the knot in Tiny Johnson's parlour in the afternoon of December the 3rd. News of their marriage did not go down well with the press, who slated the pair of them. Now, politics was becoming the centre of the storm that surrounded Jack Johnson, and it forced his two black attorneys, Edward H. Wright and W.G. Anderson, to have their names stricken from the records because they were so appalled. They assured the New York Times that they no longer wished to be associated with them. None of that seemed to faze Johnson. He tried to travel to Canada with Lucille, but he was stopped by federal agents and brought back to Chicago. A judge ruled that he was within his right to travel for a weekend to Canada and gave the agents a dressing down. If it wasn't bad enough, those within the inner circle began to turn on Johnson. Sig Hart was now spying on the Johnsons for the government and filing reports on what his old employer was up to. His mum stressed that she will lose her home if Johnson attempts to skip bail, and his brother Charlie Johnson went to the authorities claiming that someone had threatened to bump him off if he went through with his plans to testify against Johnson in the smuggling case. That case was finally ready to be heard, but Johnson was struck down with pneumonia, so the case was postponed. Now, once Johnson was better, he celebrated his 35th birthday at his mother's house, and it was quite the shindig. When the smuggling case was finally heard in court, Johnson pled nolo contendere, which is a plea by which a defendant in a criminal prosecution accepts conviction but does not plead or admit guilt. Now, he paid a $1,000 fine and the smuggling case was dropped. On May the 5th, 1913, the case of the United States versus John Arthur Johnson finally got underway in Chicago's Federal Building.
2 days later, Assistant District Attorney Parkin addressed the 12 jurors the case against Jack Johnson. These 12 jurors were as redneck white as you can imagine. Parkin promised to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Johnson had three purposes for bail: prostitution, the giving up of a woman's body to indiscriminate intercourse; debauchery, by which he meant traveling and sleeping with two and sometimes three women; and a third purpose, almost too obscene to mention, which was to compel these women to commit the crime against nature upon his body. It's just fucking stupid. It's just absolutely ridiculous. He would demonstrate how Johnson controlled the three women with whom he often travelled, and showed that he had ordered Bell to come to Chicago and Pittsburgh. They keep mentioning that. Had sent her $75,000 for a ticket and spent an additional $1,200 setting her up as a madam. And he would show that Johnson was himself one of the men who practiced immoral purposes and conduct in that flat.
Now, Benjamin Bachrach began his case for the defence by begging the jury to maintain open minds. When Johnson came into prominence as a pugilist, he said, "As is customary with a certain class of women, sporting women, they are attached by an exhibition of physical prowess and throw themselves in the way of a pugilist." The evidence would show that Belle Schreiber was an ordinary prostitute when she first met Johnson, that she often moved from sporting house to sporting house for reasons having nothing to do with the champion. He reminded them that nothing Johnson did before July the 1st, 1910, the date the Mann Act went into force, was relevant to the case. He then went on to say, a bachelor having intercourse with a woman not his wife, it was no crime against the laws of the United States. Bachrach then declared that he had never sent her money to move from Pittsburgh to Chicago, and he'd given her money to rent and furnish an apartment only because he wanted to help her establish a home for her pregnant sister and her aging mother. And he said he did not get her to engage in any prostitution. She was a prostitute, and always had been, so far as he knew, and there was not anything that he did in any way that violated any federal law.
6 witnesses testified against Johnson. Jack Mervyn, his chauffeur, Lillian Painter, who ran the Pittsburgh whorehouse, John T. Lewis, the building manager at the Ridgewood, Bertha Morrison, who also worked out at the sporting flat on Ridgewood, John O'Hallahan, a Chicago petrol man, and finally Leopold Moss was the Marshall Ventilated Mattress Company. And he gave a detailed receipt and the list of furnishings that she bought, including the 4 mattresses he had sold to the champion for Belle's flat. Now, Belle was the main witness, and she stuck to her guns even during the court's examination. Hattie McClay was also called, but Bachrach cut short her story by successfully objecting because they'd been together long before. It was like July 1st, 2010, 1910. So her testimony was basically relevant. It was before the Mann Act. When Johnson stood trial, Parkin spoke mostly of things that happened before the Mann Act, just trying to build a description, a character to these jurors. He even asked about his fights with Kaufman and Ketchel, indicating that they were fixed. Not quite sure what that meant, as if to say that he's a dodgy guy. It was just a bit of a waste of time. You can read the whole things there. You can capture it. This guy just asking stupid questions. Then once all witnesses had been heard, Bachrach immediately moved that since the government had failed to produce any evidence of debauchery or crimes against nature, 4 of the 11 indictments were actually thrown out, and Judge Carpenter agreed. All 4 were dismissed. It was now down to the jury to decide on the other 7 charges. The case went to the jury at 10 in the evening. In less than 2 hours, Johnson was found guilty of all counts. Sentencing was set for June 4th. All Johnson said was, "I have nothing to say, not a thing. My attorneys will speak for me."
Now, Judge Carpenter, he sentenced Johnson to 1 year and 1 day and to be fined $1,000. Johnson's lawyers had 2 weeks to file an appeal. Johnson said afterwards, "Oh well, they crucified Christ. Why not me?" On Tuesday evening, June the 24th, the heavyweight champion of the world disappeared. Johnson's escape had been planned for a while. Benjamin Bachrach had persuaded Judge Carpenter to halve the $30,000 bail, thus making a real estate agent named Matthew Baldwin, the guy who put up half the bail, the sole bondsman, and guaranteeing that Johnson's mother could hold on to house while he was gone. Now, violation of the Mann Act was not an extraditable offence north of the border, but as a convicted criminal, he might still have been deported back to the United States as an undesirable alien. Now, to get around that, Johnson had quietly purchased tickets from Chicago to Le Havre via Montreal, thus making himself an alien in transit through Canada, and thus untouchable. Now, Lucille met Johnson in Canada on her own before they vanished with 2 of his cars, which had been sent ahead. Now, how did he do it? Well, Johnson had arranged to meet his friend Ruby Foster and his Giants baseball team, who were waiting for a train to Canada. As soon as the train pulled in, Johnson and Gus, their arms full of bats and gloves, climbed aboard with the ball players. White policemen patrolled the station, but unable to distinguish one big athletic black man from another, they failed to recognise the champion. The train pulled out, Johnson stepped into the drawing room he'd reserved for himself, and he locked the door. He told his British listeners, "I am not a coward, gentlemen, but I can assure you, I trembled every time the car stopped." Now, when Jack Johnson, his wife, and Gus Rhodes arrived in Paris, they had difficulty finding a hotel. Being a fugitive, of course, made it a little tricky, but they did manage to find a place that was happy for them to stay. Johnson continued with his usual shows to get some money in. He was received in some welcomely, but others he was booed off the stage and had vegetables thrown at him. Now, his reputation as a fighter had gone downhill, so the French Boxing Federation declared the world's heavyweight title vacant. Now, there were two reasons. Johnson had been sentenced to prison in his own country, and more importantly, he seemed unwilling to face serious challenges, most notably Sam Langford. Now, to reassert his ownership of the title and to make some money, Johnson agreed to face battling Jim Johnson in December in Paris and to take on Frank Moran, a white hope from Pittsburgh, in the same city the following month.
Johnson defended his world title against battling Jim Johnson in Paris on December 19. He was the only black challenger he fought during his reign. It was a very quiet 2 rounds, to say the least. One ringside report said that the spectators loudly protested that the men were not fighting and demanded their money back. Jack Johnson said he had injured his left arm in the 3rd round and could not use it, but ringsiders said he used it less often and lightly fractured it when they both fell to the mat in the 10th round. Post-fight examination revealed a slight fracture of the radial in his left arm. The fight was decided by the referee and he called it a draw. And Jack Johnson walked away with just over $1,000, and with the Moran fight now having to be rescheduled. While Johnson sat ringside watching a fight between 2 Frenchmen, an American named C.F. Batelli, who worked for the Chicago Examiner, asked Johnson if he paid $25,000 in bribes to federal officials in order to allow him to flee the country. Johnson dictated his statement. He said, "I am delighted that some people in Chicago are beginning to be awake to the fact that I have been shamefully treated and am the victim of blackmailing officials in that city. Just before I got away, I handed $20,000 to Roy Jones, who said he was sent to me by a man named the Woody, who represented Harry Parkin, assistant district attorney. The Woody and Parkin used to frequent my saloon during the early part of my trouble in Chicago. They were accommodated in a private room back of my saloon. In various sums, I paid out this way at a total of $25,000. I am going back to see the thing through when the time is ripe, and I think that will be soon." And proved the case was a put-up job against me. The truth was finally out, he said. He could hardly wait to get home and tell his wife.
Now, back in Chicago, the accusations were heard in a court. DeWoody called the charges absurd. Parkin said he'd never taken $1. Roy Jones said Johnson was just out to get even with him for having testified about the beating of Etta, although he also thought his old friend had got a dirty deal somewhere. Now, in the end, no one was indicted. Johnson attempted to please the crowds in England and Wales, but neither greeted him too fondly. They wanted Johnson to fight Langford for $3,000, but he turned down the offer. His reason, he said, is I defeated Langford already, and not only that, Langford has already been beaten 4 times in the last 2 years. Johnson then wrote an open letter stating, "I am ready to fight them all and bar no one at $30,000 apiece." The trouble was, Johnson was fighting Frank Moran for a percentage of the purse, not $30,000. He even produced a fake video that showed Moran's manager, Dan McKettrick, handing Johnson a moody $30,000 check to try and portray he was a man of his word. The truth was that Johnson needed the money, so keeping the world title was his way of keeping the money coming. Fight Langford and lose, and then he would have no bargaining chips left. The fight with Moran looked like it had been fixed. Moran was supposed to go down within 8 rounds, but he didn't. Johnson had been double-crossed, realising after just the first round. In the end, the fight went the 20-round distance, and George Carpentier, the reigning European heavyweight champion and future world light heavyweight champion who refereed the fight, gave the wide decision to Johnson. There was a contract dispute between Moran and his manager McKettrick, who hired Lucien Cerf, a French attorney, to deposit the $34,000 purse from the fight and hold it until the dispute had been settled. Of that, Johnson should have been handed $14,400, and he left for St. Petersburg with Lucille and Gus Rhodes without being paid, but would collect when they returned.
So while in Russia, the three, Gus, by the way, is his nephew, the three enjoyed the hospitality and had plenty of fun until August 1st, when Germany declared war on Russia and the Great War began. There was like the 10 and I think it was the 10 and 20 rule. You got 10 seconds to get your stuff and you got 20 seconds to get the fuck out of here. I mean, that's what they told them. They were told to leave the country immediately, and they lost most of their 14 trunks while changing trains at Warsaw. They paid bribes to board another train to Belgium before finally arriving in Paris, which was in absolute turmoil. Johnson got one of his cars out of storage and headed for the Channel to escape to England. He remembered crossing one way while British troops were coming the other way to fight, and hearing the bang of German guns. News then filtered through that Lucien Cerf, who had Johnson's money from the fight with Moran, had actually joined the French army and was actually killed early in World War One. The paperwork was lost. The bank said it had no record of the deposit, and no one ever collected their money.
Now, while studying in a flat in Paddington, London, Johnson was contacted by his old friend and promoter, Jack Curley, about a fight against Jess Willard. Now, Johnson accepted the deal, and they worked out together over the next few days while in London. Johnson was to get $30,000 plus training expenses, the same sum Tommy Burns had received to risk his title against Johnson in Sydney, for a 45-round bout against Willard in Mexico at a site close as possible to the US border so the American fans could get there. And he was to get 1/3 of the foreign film rights as well. But there was another version of events that Johnson later wrote in his life, and it was to take a dive, and it would be more financially viable for him to do that. Plus, that he would be able to then return to the USA and not be sent to prison and be able to see his northern again. Johnson finished with, after that conversation, I did not care anymore for the title of the world's champion than a child does for the stick from which a lollipop has vanished. Curley went back to America to start planning the fight, and the date was set for March 6, 1915, initially in Mexico. Johnson, Lucille and Gus got a boat to Havana in Cuba with the hope of getting another to Mexico. Jess Willard had arrived in El Paso to start training by then. Then on February the 22nd, Curley got a telegram from Johnson in Havana, and he said he wasn't coming to Mexico because ships here had refused clearance from Tampico or other Mexican ports because of trouble in that country. Bring the fight here. This is an ideal spot for it. Now, Curley arrived in Havana, and he decided to make plans to move the fight, so it was rescheduled the day after Easter, Monday the 5th of April, in Havana, Cuba. Jack Johnson and Jess Willard.
Johnson was the favourite going into the fight, but some were suggesting the fix was on again due to how lacklustre Johnson was in training. He countered that claim. He said, there is not enough money in Cuba to make me forfeit my title to Willard or anyone else. I like the honour of being heavyweight champion of the world, and when I lose it, there will be a knockout administered by a better man, and that won't be Willard. They fought in well over 100-degree heat and the 20,000 in attendance were all pro Willard. Johnson was at his usual relaxed self, and he took the first 7 rounds comfortably, leaving his challenger baffled. But Willard was showing his usefulness as he backed up Johnson in the 8th and the 9th round. That was the only real joy he had by all accounts, and Johnson once again came back. He was tiring in the heat, but he was streaks ahead on any scorecard by round 21. Then he struggled through the next 3 before calling Jack Curley over to his corner. By the end of the 25th, Johnson leaned down and whispered to him, "Jack, go take my wife away. Tell her I'm awful weak and that I want her to leave." The New York Herald reporter wrote, Johnson looked pitifully toward his wife. His expression was a hopeless one of despair and helplessness that those who saw it will never forget. It was as though Johnson had called aloud to his wife, "The end has come. They've been clamoring for this for the last 5 years. Now they've got me."
Now the next round was the last. Willard fainted to the body and hurled an overhand right to his jaw. Johnson fell forward and grabbed at Willard's legs to keep him from collapsing completely. The challenger kicked himself free. Johnson was sprawled out on his back and he lay motionless, his right arm over his face. The crowd was on its feet. Welch began the count, and Johnson did not move. Welch reached 10, and he raised Willard's hand in victory. Hundreds of spectators waved white handkerchiefs and flags in honour of the white man's triumph. Johnson issued an official statement after the fight, and he said he'd been beaten fairly by youth and condition. "I have no complaints to make accepting this. While I was champion, I made a great many enemies, most of whom hated me for no other reason than that I am a Negro. These persons have gotten vindication in my defeat, and I hope they obtain the full enjoyment out of it." Now Johnson later admitted to Jack Curley that Willard knocked out his gold teeth, and he said, "Jess ruined my golden smile. It was a left crack that did it. I felt them drop down on my tongue, and my pride wouldn't let me spit them out. I knew what a howl would go up if they saw them in the sunlight, so I did the next best thing. I swallowed them." Now Willard threw down the colour line immediately within hours of winning the title, and he said that just as he had never fought a black man before he faced Johnson, he would never do so again, and it would be another 22 years before another black man would win the World Heavyweight title.
Jack Johnson, absolutely legend, just swallowed his gold teeth. It's brilliant. Defeated Jack Johnson, licked his wounds, and he moved on from Havana. They sailed to Spain, then made their way to Paris, where a reporter asked Johnson if he had returned to France in order to enlist. "Man, for me, war is over. I'm at peace for the first time in years." From Paris, he moved on to London, and he actually performed at the Elephant and Castle in South London until it was bombed by the Germans. He stayed in England with Lucille for a considerable amount of time until he began to act erratically, and he got nicked a few times for things he said to certain people and after assaulting a couple as well. He assaulted one guy, punched him in the face for some reason. In January of 1916, the Home Office actually ordered Jack Johnson to leave the country under the Aliens Restriction Act. They then moved on to Spain, where he continued to perform. He was doing strongman stuff now in his performances because he was on his way down in Madrid and Barcelona, for which he continued to bill himself as the champion of the world. Johnson, Lucille, Gus stayed in Spain for 3 years. He actually fought 4 times, winning all by stoppage. They were against pretty poor opponents. They opened the Barcelona Cafe, and Johnson acted in a movie. Johnson then began to spread rumours that he had indeed taken a dive against Jess Willard. Many believed this to be the case in an effort to have his Mann Act charges dropped. Willard, though, sarcastically responded, "If he was going to throw the fight, I wish he had done it sooner. It was hotter than hell out there."
Now, on April the 6th, 1917, the United States entered the war. Johnson later wrote about his wartime adventures as an undercover agent. He had taken numerous risks, including the traversing of rough water into dangerous and out-of-the-way places, infested not only by possible war enemies, but by smugglers and other engaged in outlaw practices. Then, too, there was the danger of capture by the enemy and of death by promiscuous shooting, which frequently took place between the furtive craft in those waters. From my work and the information I obtained, I received due recognition from the officials under whose instructions I operated, and I had the great satisfaction of being service to my native country, even though I was still in exile. The truth was, Johnson's career in espionage lasted only a few weeks, but by all accounts, it seemed plausible. On March 17th, 1918, Tiny Johnson died in Chicago. She was 74 and hadn't seen her favourite child in almost 5 years. Now, Johnson arrived in Mexico City on March 26, 1919, and it seemed like old times. Some 2,000 people greeted him shouting, "Bravo, Jack," and "Viva Johnson." He announced his plans for 2 motion pictures, For the Love of the Flag and The Call of the Heart. But as always, Johnson had to fall back on boxing to pay the bills. He fought 5 times in Mexico and won all 5, as in Spain, by stoppage. He headed to North Mexico and was the closest he had ever been to America in years. Tijuana was perfect for Jack Johnson. He haunted the racetrack, knocked over carefully selected opponents in the bull ring, and presided over a ramshackle saloon and a gambling palace called the Main Event. Old friends were able to meet up with him, but he was eager to return, sending letters to the US in hope of making his return as relaxed as possible. One of his oldest friends, Tom Carey, offered Johnson to borrow up to $50,000 to get himself out of trouble. Now, Johnson did decide to take Carey up on his offer and began negotiating his surrender by telephone with federal and state officials in California. He wanted to go straight to Chicago, and he said he wanted a black deputy sheriff to escort him, and he wanted no indignities, no handcuffs, no strong-arm stuff. Now, no one made him any promises. Johnson was now being cornered into a return, which made him feel pressured. On June the 5th, a Tijuana judge ordered him to leave Mexican territory within 30 days.
Jack Johnson was finally ready on the morning of July 20. The Los Angeles Times noted that he stopped at Main Event for one last drink. Several white women there drank with him at the bar, wishing him good luck and regretting that he was leaving. The only time Johnson lost his famous little laugh or smile was when he started away from the crowd there. He applied his handkerchief vigorously to his eyes, saying it was hard to leave friends. He surrendered to federal agents at the Mexican border. Johnson said, "I'm back home and it sure feels mighty good. It is home sweet home for me, and no one has ever been away can know how good it feels to get back again." He was then sent to the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, to serve his sentence on September 19, 1920. He became prison number 15461. Johnson wrote of his time in prison, "In all, my imprisonment was in no wise as severe as I had anticipated. There was virtually no one over me, and there was no one to whom I was answerable to in the performance of my duties in the prison, except the executives." Johnson actually fought in a box fest while in prison on Thanksgiving. He put on a fine show by all accounts, and then had another in May while seeking his early release. He had many offers for fights upon his release. One in particular was against Harry Wills, who was the most likely candidate, which didn't materialise. Then in the morning of July 9th, 1921, at the age of 43, Jack Johnson walked through the front gate of Leavenworth Penitentiary a free man. He recalled, "Many close friends came to meet me at the gates. There was a sort of general celebration, the extent and nature of which surprised and disconcerted me. There were 4 bands, hundreds of people. If I ever felt that my life had been a failure, I changed my opinion and found myself rejoicing, eager, and confident.
Now, Johnson continued with his exhibition shows, but some dates were cancelled. He acted in some movies, but inevitably he would return to the ring, to what he knows best. Now, some states refused to issue him a boxing licence, but in February of 1923, he was working in New York as a $250 a day sparring partner for Luis Angel Firpo. That same year, he went back to Cuba and had 2 fights. On his return, he went into a joint partnership venture for a club called the Café de Luxe. Johnson was able to entertain guests and play bass like he had done at his own Café de Champion. It was such a hit that the representatives of the British-born gangster Owen Madden decided to take it over as the ideal spot to peddle his #1 beer. Now, according to the New York Times, Lucille Cameron Johnson sued her husband for divorce in February of 1924, citing evidence involving Johnson and other white women. After the divorce, he began drinking heavily again, and he crashed his car 4 times during the year, walking away from one accident near Elgin, Illinois, with a scalp wound that required 20 stitches. He then met Irene Marie Pinu and her friend Helen Matthews and began a love triangle, but in the end he had to choose one and he decided on Irene, and they were married in August of 1925. Now, from 1924 to 1931, Jack Johnson fought 9 times in Canada, Mexico and in America. He won 4 2-1 points, 1 by knockout and 1 by disqualification, and lost 5 times. In July 1927, Johnson published his American autobiography, Jack Johnson, In the Ring and Out. Johnson and Irene travelled more of Europe during the 30s, but returned to America from Paris when Adolf Hitler was beginning to invade surrounding countries. Johnson witnessed Joe Louis become the first black man to win the world heavyweight title since his era, but he disliked Chappie Blackburn intently, so continued to knock Joe Louis throughout his career. But he did tell Nat Fleischer, "Whatever I say, it seems to get me in trouble. Everybody thinks I'm jealous of Joe Louis, but it ain't so. Louis, to me, is the hardest hitter that ever fought, but I still think his stance is all wrong."
On the evening of June 9th, 1946, Johnson was on his way back from Texas when he pulled into a diner just outside North Carolina. With him was a young man named Fred L. Cook, whom he had hired to relieve him at the wheel when he got tired. They told us we could eat at the back or not at all. Cook remembered. We were hungry and the food had already been served, so we ate. But back in the car, Jack really got angry. Johnson took the wheel, his latest high-powered automobile, a Lincoln Zephyr, and roared north along Highway 1 at better than 70 miles per hour, hurtling around a sharp curve near the little town of Franklinton. He didn't see the truck rushing toward him until it was too late. He lost control. The car swerved across the white line, left the road, and slammed into a telephone pole. Frank Cook was thrown clear and survived. Jack Johnson died in the hospital some 3 hours later. He was buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. When asked by a reporter at Johnson's funeral what she, as in his wife at the time, what she loved about him, her reply was, "I loved him because of his courage. He faced the world unafraid. There wasn't anybody or anything he feared."
I gotta be honest, it's been an absolutely unbelievable story. This the longest podcast that we've ever done in its total. It's like 4 hours in total for the 2
Jesus.
parts. It's amazing, but we couldn't not do this for Jack Johnson, could we? You know, all these stories and everything we've done about Jack Johnson, and you know, we've alluded to him in different episodes, and it was only right that we needed to do something. So we'll move into our last part of the episode, and you know, just sort of highlighting the accolades and a few more stories posthumously. So, as we know, Johnston, he fought professionally. Would you believe it? Until the age of 60. And he finished his boxing career with a record of 54 wins, 11 losses, and 8 draws and 34 knockouts. Although others actually do suggest, other records do suggest that he had 73 wins, 13 losses, and 10 draws. Johnson fought in many cellar fights that were not documented, so the chances are he fought in many, many more unknown bouts. And we talked about the Battle Royales in part 1 as well. I mean, you count all them as well, and it's even more, isn't it? So he did make his final ring appearance at the age of 67 on November the 27th, 1945, fighting 3 one-minute exhibition rounds against 2 opponents. They were Joe Jeanette and John Balcourt in a benefit fight card for the US war bonds. That footage, again, you can actually find the footage of that. That's available online as well. And it's crazy to see him at that age, just doing a little bit of a sparring session with Joe Jeanette. Now, there was a play entitled The Great White Hope, which opened in 1968, and it starred the legendary James Earl Jones as Jack Johnson. It told the story of how white America demanded a Great White Hope and its effects on Johnson. The play, of course, later became a film. In 2005, the filmmaker Ken Burns produced a 2-part documentary about Johnson's life. What a great documentary this is, by the way. Unforgivable Blackness, the rise and fall of Jack Johnson, based on the 2004 non-fiction book of the same name by Jeffrey C. Ward, and with music by Wynton Marsalis. The book won the William Hill Sports Book of the Year. Again, great book, great documentary, obviously helped us with source material, amongst many other things as well.
Absolutely, the other book, exactly. Jeffries C. Ward is definitely a great source for our material, and obviously the documentary is fantastic. But yeah, I mean, we've got to mention the fact that Mike Tyson, Harry Reid, and John McCain lent their support to the campaign, starting a Change.org petition asking at that time was Obama to retrospectively pardon Jack Johnson for his racially motivated 1913 felony conviction. Former WBC President Jose Salomon had actually reached out to different presidential administrations, which date back as far as the Ronald Reagan time in office. Finally, on April 2018, who would have thought it? President Donald Trump announced that he would be considering granting a full pardon to Johnson after speaking with the WBC committee, along with actor Sylvester Stallone. And then Donald Trump. I mean, you think of all the racism crap that's gone on here.
Of all people.
And then of all people, it's just crazy. But he pardoned Johnson on May 24th, 2018, 105 years after his conviction, during a ceremony which included special guests Mauricio Solomon, Hector Solomon, Sylvester Stallone, Deontay Wilder as well, and Lennox Lewis.
Now, Jack Johnson, he was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame way back in 1954. And we've got a couple of quotes from him, and then one from the writer Stanley Crouch, who said this about Jack Johnson. Johnson was a pure individual. He did everything exactly the way he wanted to do it. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that he, Jack Johnson, should be anybody else's version of Jack Johnson. And we've got 3 quotes from Johnson himself. And he said, "My friend told me later he got the chicken pox. I told him I caught politics and never got over it."
Brilliant. So the other one, slow down everyone, you're moving too fast. That's not a bad one at all. And I made a lot of mistakes out of the ring, but I never made any in it. Class, amazing. Absolute class. What a flipping a marathon of a story. But you know what? The crazy thing is, this is what we're baffled about, is the crazy thing is, for you guys that are listening, there are so many more stories. I can't even tell you that we could have got on. It's crazy. Maybe we should come back and do a 3-part show and just add all the stories that we haven't been able to add in these 2 parts. But wow, what a guy Jack Johnson is.
It's been an amazing ride, an amazing story, and we hope that we've done it justice because, as we rightly pointed out, there's the Unforgivable Blackness book. It's a huge book. I've got it in my bookcase. The documentary is 3 hours long. Our podcast looks like it's about 4 hours long. So there you go. You know, we've managed to put that much into it that we hope we've been able to tell you some fantastic stories. And I know a lot of the stories in this part of the story has been a lot more about what's happened outside of the ring, but I think it sets a lot of context to what he was like and who he was. And yeah, he was obviously a womanizer. You know, we can't deny the fact he was a womanizer, but he did things his own way, and he was subjected to so much racial abuse. It was absolutely unbelievable. But it's like he just brushed it off his shoulder like a piece of dirt or a bit of dust, and he thought, you know what? I don't give a fuck. I'm just going to get on with what I'm getting on with, and I'm going to live my life the way I want to live it. And the ironic thing is obviously him passing away, him dying like he did at the age he died at, in the way and the manner he died at, in an automobile accident, in a car accident, ironically, because of all them years of speeding up and down, the infamous ticket moment when he gave the police officer the $100 to tell him he was going to be speeding on his way back. There's so many unbelievable moments throughout his life and his career as a boxer as well, becoming the first black heavyweight champion of the world. I mean, that's some amazing feat to be able to do in a time which was so racist and so horrible for the black community. And I've really enjoyed sitting down to really get to know more than what I already knew about Jack Johnson. I've read that book, I've watched that documentary, but even doing the research for it, you find out so much more. And like you said, Johnston, you rightly pointed out, there could have been so much more to this episode that could have made it even longer. But guys, we didn't want to completely bore you to death with a 6-7 hour podcast, because I believe that's as much as what you could probably get out of Jack Johnson with all the stuff that he's done throughout his life and his career. So we want to say a big thank you to everybody first and foremost for bearing with us and listening to these two parts for this amazing story of Jack Johnson. And we hope that you have been compelled, we hope that you have been gripped by it all, because we certainly have, recording it and sitting down to go through it. It's been absolutely amazing. And if you have enjoyed it, please do let us know. Please drop us a tweet at career_profiles or send us a message on the Facebook page at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Please do let us know what you thought about it. Or on Instagram, you can find us on there. We really would appreciate the feedback for this one. We know how much you really enjoyed the Sam Langford episode. We had many messages about that one. Please let us know if we have done justice for this one as well. It's been an amazing ride, an amazing tale, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, the career profile of Jack Johnson.